今兵符奉还，远征北海。今兵符奉还。
既然太师不愿在魏国尽忠，
末将邓婵玉请魏大王讨伐反贼。
末将愿率800骑兵及魔家4将。
本王赐你去吧，为我而战。
赤军抓来的西岐船夫，
再大声点儿！
西岐几方？来部下马受降。
他们见识见识，亲去！
这么快啊！
你的刀打起，先后上。
反贼的话我会信吗？
有危险！
个会法。现在进攻，会不会？
潘小，
这是什么法术啊？又是烽火琵琶。
且慢！
跟我走。一命还一命，我不欠你。
住手！
你是太子殿下。
殷郊，
我听他的命令，杀了你就是谋反。
还敢来几步？
我已查明他的将功赎罪的。
这个葫芦给 殷郊，
得看我们金鳌岛的。这些苦。
今夜西岐北山。
有情况，不能过去！地公啊！不能！我多你西蒙夫，快！他就像这样。神盾，水遁。
小心激光！师叔，
众是个什么邪术？
我在找文种。
快，让大家远离门场。
你的交情上，我就再让西岐人活命。
真是为了封神榜而来呀！绝阵阵眼。
太晚了，
激发！我的身子越来越沉，没用啊！
车中问。
停战！ 次机会。破了十绝阵，你也得死！快够了！
殷郊已死，
必有弥天大祸。
我一定把父王请来，全家
父王自毁献祭。
死，元气却久久，
孩儿无伤父王。
元气不散，皆因
怨念如此深重之。
娇就是未来的天下公主，是人间最后的希望。
不好，
法散开，他越血。
法力都被他吸去。
我们犯下了。
In the epic continuation of the mythological saga, Creation of the Gods 2 picks up the shattered pieces of a fallen dynasty. Ji-Fa returns to Siki to mount a desperate rebellion against the tyrannical King Zhou and his demonic consort Daji. As ancient gods and mortals collide, old friendships are tested, and epic sacrifices shape the destiny of an entire realm. Hey guys, today we are diving deep into the magical, incredibly dramatic world of Creation of the Gods 2. We are picking right back up with Ji-Fa, who just barely survived the most toxic workplace environment in ancient history, returning to his roots to build a resistance against the ultimate bad boss, King Zhou. The stakes are higher, the magic is wilder, and the family drama is off the charts. If you had a good time with this, a like and a subscribe is a free way to help me keep making more. We open with the freezing, biting wind of the wilderness howling across the screen. Ji-Fa is slumped over his snow-white steed, his body battered and bruised from the chaotic escape from Zago. The crunch of snow beneath the horse's hooves is the only sound breaking the deafening silence of the frozen wasteland. You can practically feel the agonizing cold radiating off the screen, and the tactile sensation of Ji-Fa's frozen, blood-stained fingers gripping the reins is enough to make anyone want to put on a heavy winter coat. He is barely holding on, driven solely by the desperate need to return to his father and his homeland. This is a kid who has been through the ultimate emotional ringer. He spent years idolizing King Zhou, treating him like a second father, only to realize that the guy is a bloodthirsty tyrant who would not hesitate to murder his own family for a bit of extra power. It is the kind of betrayal that leaves a massive psychological mark, and you can see that trauma etched into every line of Ji-Fa's exhausted face. He's not just running from a terrifying army, he's running from his own shattered worldview. It's like finding out your favorite superhero is actually a supervillain, but way worse because this supervillain literally tried to have you executed in front of a cheering crowd. Eventually, the harsh whites and grays of the winter landscape begin to soften, melting into the warm, golden hues of Shichi. The transition is stunning, shifting from the harsh metallic clang of weapons and Shago to the soft rustle of wheat fields swaying in the gentle breeze. The contrast is highly intentional, highlighting the fundamental difference between the two realms. Shago is a place of death, unchecked ambition, and cold, hard stone. Shichi is a place of life, agricultural growth, and the deep warmth of family. When Ji-Fa finally collapses at the massive wooden gates of his childhood home, the thud of his body hitting the dirt is a heavy, exhausted sound. His reunion with his father, Ji-Chang, is a tearjerker of epic proportions. Ji-Chang rushes out, his footsteps frantic and uneven on the gravel, pulling his prodigal son into an embrace that speaks volumes without a single word. The rough texture of Ji Chang's coarse woven robes against Ji Fa's battered, mud-caked armor creates a profound sense of tactile grounding. Ji Fa is finally safe, but the emotional scars are still bleeding profusely. They sit by the fire later that night, the sharp crackle of the flames providing a soothing auditory backdrop to their heavy, mournful conversation. Ji Fa pours his heart out, recounting the horrors he witnessed, the brutal execution of his friends, and the monstrous nature of the king he once served so proudly. Ji Chang listens patiently, his aged face a map of deep sorrow and profound wisdom. He knows that peace is a fleeting illusion, and that the horrific storm brewing in Xiago will soon wash over their tranquil, sunlit lands. Meanwhile, back in the dark, oppressive halls of Zhaogei, things are getting incredibly weird and highly disturbing. Yin Shou, who we last saw getting pretty thoroughly stabbed and left for dead, is not exactly dead. Thanks to the dark, chaotic magic of Daji, the nine-tailed fox demon, he is undergoing a gruesome supernatural resurrection. The sounds of this dark process are deeply unsettling to the core. There is the wet, sickening, squelching noise of torn flesh knitting back together, accompanied by the eerie, low-frequency hum of pure demonic energy. Daji hovers over his broken body, her magical aura swirling like thick, suffocating smoke that smells faintly of copper and rotting flowers. She is not just healing him, she is fundamentally changing him on a cellular level, stripping away the last remnants of his mortal humanity and replacing it with pure, unalterated malice. When Yin Shou finally opens his eyes, they completely lack any trace of the charismatic, beloved leader he once was. He is now a creature of pure, dark ambition, completely unmoored from any moral compass or ethical restraint. Daji purrs softly in his ear, feeding his wild delusions of total godhood. It is honestly the most toxic codependent relationship ever put to film, making standard couples therapy look completely inadequate for dealing with magical megalomania. Yin Shou rises slowly from his cold stone slab, the heavy, metallic scrape of his dark armor against the polished floor echoing through the massive, empty chamber. He demands total obedience from the universe, and he is fully ready to burn the entire world to the ground just to get it. Far away from the intense mortal political drama, we find Zhang Ziya standing on the mystical, snow-capped peaks of Mount Kunlun. He is carrying a rather gruesome piece of cargo, the severed head of In Zhao, the tragic prince who stood up to his tyrannical father and paid the ultimate bloody price. The air up here is incredibly thin and razor crisp, with the constant, gentle whoosh of eternal celestial winds sweeping across the icy, jagged crags. Zhang Ziya seeks a desperate audience with the Grand Immortals, hoping to rewrite a terrible wrong that has unbalanced the mortal realm. The Celestial Palace is a marvel of ethereal, impossible architecture, glowing with a soft, pulsing light that feels entirely alien compared to the dirt and blood of the human world below. The Grand Immortals, floating in their pristine robes, finally agree to help, and what follows is one of the most visually stunning sequences in the entire movie. They use sacred, glowing lotus roots to construct a completely new body for the fallen prince. The sensory details in this scene are absolutely incredible. You can distinctly hear the crisp, wet snap of the heavy lotus stems being broken, the rushing, melodic sound of magical healing water, and the low, resonant thrum of divine energy binding the organic plant matter together into a humanoid shape. When the severed head is gently placed upon the floral torso, a blinding, explosive flash of brilliant green light erupts across the screen, followed instantly by the sudden, sharp, ragged gasp of a man violently returning to life. In Zhao sits up frantically, his new green limbs creaking like fresh wet wood bending under pressure. He is alive, but he is fundamentally, psychologically broken inside. His very first conscious thoughts are of his father's horrific betrayal, the cold, unforgiving steel of the massive executioner's blade hitting his neck, and the crushing, suffocating weight of his failed duty to the realm. He is a walking, breathing, existential crisis, forced to navigate a completely new existence in a body essentially made of a complex magical salad. It is a really tough break for a guy who literally just wanted his dad to love him and stop murdering innocent people.
Back down in the muddy, chaotic mortal realm, the terrifying sound of full-scale war is rapidly approaching. Grand Tutor Wenzhong, a fiercely loyal and incredibly powerful veteran general of the Shang dynasty, has finally returned from his grueling northern campaigns. The arrival of his massive, battle-hardened army is an overwhelming, terrifying auditory experience. The rhythmic, thunderous stomping of thousands upon thousands of heavy armored boots shakes the very earth beneath the camera. The harsh clatter of long spears, the wet snorting of massive, terrifying war beasts, and the sharp, piercing, wailing calls of the massive bronze war horns create a terrifying symphony of impending doom. Wenzhong rides a terrifying, mythical beast, a massive creature of thick scale and dense muscle that breathes actual sparks of dark, crackling energy. The Grand Tutor himself is a highly imposing, terrifying figure, heavily armored in dark metal, with a mysterious, deeply unsettling third eye resting tightly closed upon his weathered forehead. When he officially enters the gates of Zhage, the air instantly grows cold and heavy. He is a strict man of honor, fiercely dedicated to the ancestral laws of the long-lasting dynasty. When he sees exactly what Inshou has become, and immediately recognizes the heavy demonic taint of Daji lingering in the throne room, he is deeply, profoundly conflicted. The tension in the massive room is thick and palpable, a heavy, suffocating silence hanging in the air like a thick fog before a terrible storm. Wenzhong tightly grips the leather hilt of his massive magical whips, the thick leather groaning audibly under his incredibly tight grasp. He fiercely questions his deranged king, demanding clear answers for the utter chaos and the horrific slaughter of innocents he has seen on the streets. But Inshou is a master manipulator of the highest order. He smoothly plays on Wenzhong's deep-seated, lifelong loyalty to the state, spinning a complex, deceitful narrative of violent rebellion and treason brewing in Siki. Despite his heavy misgivings and his gut feeling that something is terribly wrong, the Grand Tutor slowly kneels. He chooses blind duty over basic morality, a deeply tragic character flaw that completely seals his violent fate and sets him on a direct, unavoidable collision course with our heroes. He is the ultimate uncompromising company man, fully willing to go down with the massive ship even when the crazy captain is actively, gleefully setting the deck on fire.
Over in the peaceful lands of Shiki, the frantic preparations for a desperate war are in full swing. Shifa has completely shed his former identity as a terrified hostage and fully embraced his massive destiny as a military leader. The sweeping scenes of him organizing the massive town defenses are incredibly rich with deep tactile imagery. You can almost feel the rough splintering wood of the massive barricades being rapidly erected, and loudly hear the sharp, rhythmic ringing of heavy blacksmith's hammers striking glowing red-hot iron anvils. The intense, suffocating heat of the massive roaring forges radiates directly off the screen, contrasting sharply with the cool, highly anxious sweat shining on the young faces of the terrified, untrained soldiers. Jifa moves constantly among his people, his voice calm and steady, but his heart incredibly heavy with dread. He is desperately training a militia of simple farmers to fight against a massive army of highly trained killers and terrifying magical beings. It is the absolute ultimate underdog story, and Jifa knows the brutal odds are stacked impossibly high against them. He spends his sleepless nights poring intensely over ancient, dusty maps, the dry, papery rustle of the old scrolls completely breaking the dead quiet of his dark command tent. Zheng Zaya eventually arrives in Shiki, bringing with him a massive wealth of complex magical knowledge and a few highly powerful celestial tricks hidden up his wide sleeves. Zheng Zaya serves perfectly as the eccentric but deeply wise mentor, constantly dropping massive philosophical truth bombs while casually performing mind-bending, reality-altering magic in the background. He slowly teaches Jifa that true, lasting leadership is not at all about wielding absolute power, but about deeply understanding the massive weight of the human lives you are personally responsible for. It is a beautiful, stark contrast to Yin Shu's horrific philosophy of absolute bloody domination.
The massive plot thickens considerably with the explosive introduction of Shen Gongbao's dark machinations. Shen Gongbao is the absolute worst kind of chaotic, unpredictable antagonist, a highly skilled rogue immortal with a massive, centuries-old chip on his shoulder and a serious, theatrical flair for the highly dramatic. He absolutely hates Zhang Zia with a deep, burning passion, mostly because Zhang Zia got the celestial promotion he desperately wanted. It is basically the magical, celestial equivalent of extremely petty office politics, but with massively explosive, reality-ending magical consequences. Shen Gongbao sets out immediately to actively recruit a massive array of dark, twisted immortals and violent rogue spirits to directly assist the massive Shang army. His dark journey takes him to some seriously creepy, unsettling locations, deep swamps that loudly bubble with highly toxic, glowing green gas, and dark, damp subterranean caves where the heavy air is extremely thick with the nauseating scent of damp earth and rotting ancient magic. He successfully convinces the legendary 10 Heavenly Masters to construct the horrific 10 Fated Arrays, a massive, complex series of incredibly deadly magical traps specifically designed to completely annihilate the Siki forces. The dark creation of these massive arrays is a terrible visual and highly disturbing auditory nightmare. You can clearly hear the low rumbling chanting of dark ancient mantras, a horrific sound that literally crawls under your skin and makes your back teeth ache with strange pressure. The once clear sky turns a bruised, angry, swirling purple, and the solid ground violently cracks open, releasing massive bursts of scorching, awful sulfurous air. Shen Gongbao watches his terrifying handiwork with a huge, wicked grin, practically twirling a metaphorical villain mustache. He is thoroughly, deeply enjoying the absolute chaos, completely and utterly indifferent to the massive mortal suffering he is about to directly cause.
When the very first violent skirmishes finally break out on the dusty plains, the entire movie shifts abruptly into high, terrifying gear. The massive action sequences are absolutely breathtaking, perfectly blending grounded, gritty martial arts with completely off-the-wall, explosive magical warfare. The heavy vanguard of the massive Shang army, confidently led by some of Wenzhong's absolute fiercest generals, violently clashes with the terrified Siki defenders. The massive auditory landscape instantly becomes a chaotic, deafening roar. The incredibly loud, deafening crash of heavy bronze shields violently colliding, the wet, highly sickening thud of sharp spears finding their soft, fleshy marks, and the desperate, throat-tearing screams of the horribly wounded create a deeply harrowing, unforgettable experience. Ji-Fi is right in the very thick of the bloody chaos, his sharp sword a massive, deadly blur of constant motion. The sharp, high-pitched metallic clang of his blade frantically deflecting a heavy falling halberd rings out clearly over the massive din of the brutal battle. He fights with a desperate, frantic, animalistic energy, heavily driven by the absolute need to protect his fragile home. But the massive Shang forces are incredibly relentless, and they have terrifying dark magic completely on their side. Giant, horrific, monstrous beasts violently tear through the weak defensive lines, their massive, heavy paws completely crushing thick wooden barricades like dry, brittle twigs. The sheer, overwhelming kinetic energy of the massive battle is incredibly exhausting to watch, and you can clearly see the massive physical toll it takes on Ji-Fi. His bright armor is deeply dented and completely covered in thick, dark mud, his breathing incredibly ragged and heavy. This is absolutely not a glorious romantic battle of legendary heroes. It is a desperate, muddy, highly terrifying struggle for basic human survival. Just when things look their absolute terrifying bleakest, a completely new, massive player violently enters the bloody battlefield. The dark, cloudy sky directly above tears open with a massive, completely deafening crack of thunder, and a bright figure descends rapidly, glowing with an intense, blinding emerald light. It is Yin Zhao, the fully resurrected, highly traumatized prince. His incredibly dramatic arrival stops the massive, chaotic battle completely dead in its violent tracks. The sudden, absolutely deafening silence after the massive explosion of his entrance is incredibly powerful and highly unsettling. Both massive armies just stop and stare, utterly, completely bewildered by the glowing figure. Yin Zhao lands with a massively heavy, earth-shattering thud, the dry ground instantly spiderwebbing and cracking deeply beneath his green feet. He looks fundamentally different. His eyes burn brightly with a strange, highly unearthly energy, and he tightly wields a massive glowing celestial weapon that hums loudly with intense destructive power. He slowly locks eyes across the battlefield with Ji Fa, his former absolute best friend, and the immense emotional weight of their deeply tragic shared history hangs incredibly heavily in the quiet air. Yin Zhao is a deeply tragic, highly conflicted figure, heavily torn between his strange, new divine purpose and his lingering, painful mortal memories. He slowly turns his glowing gaze toward the massive Shang army, the very forces of his own biological father, and unleashes a completely devastating, massive magical attack. The incredibly loud whoosh of his huge weapon, violently cutting through the thick air, is instantly followed by a massive, invisible shockwave that violently sends heavily armored enemy soldiers flying backward like weightless ragdolls. It is an absolutely incredible, jaw-dropping display of raw power, but it is deeply, profoundly sad to watch. Yin Zhao is violently destroying the very soldiers he once proudly commanded, actively fighting against the massive kingdom he was literally born to rule.
The true emotional core of the massive movie really shines brightly in the deeply quiet, highly intimate moments, perfectly placed between these massive, explosive set pieces. There is a deeply moving, highly emotional scene where Ji Fa and Yin Zhao finally have a quiet chance to actually talk. They sit together on a high, grassy ridge overlooking the dark, quiet battlefield, the faint, distant glow of hundreds of campfires gently twinkling in the vast darkness. The cool night wind softly rustles through the tall, dry grass, a highly soothing, melancholy sound that provides a brief respite from the war. Yin Zhao speaks slowly about the deeply strange, highly detached feeling of his new, magical lotus body. He explains that he cannot feel the biting cold of the wind, he cannot feel physical pain in the traditional sense when struck, but the deep existential ache in his immortal soul is sharper and more painful than ever before. He is heavily struggling to truly understand his bizarre place in the universe. Is he absolutely still a royal prince of the Shang dynasty, or is he something completely, terrifyingly different? Ji Fa listens quietly, his human heart absolutely breaking for his lost friend. He gently reaches out and tightly grasps Yin Zhao's green arm. The intense tactile difference is highly striking, the warm, rough, calloused hand of a deeply tired mortal resting against the smooth, slightly damp, cool texture of enchanted, magical plant matter. Ji Fa earnestly assures him that absolutely no matter what he is physically made of, he is still his true brother. It is a beautifully quiet, deeply profound moment of human connection, completely amidst the absolute terrifying madness of the massive war. It perfectly grounds the sprawling, massive story, constantly reminding us that deep beneath the massive magical explosions and the epic, sprawling political struggles, this is fundamentally a deeply human story about traumatized people trying to find their way in a completely broken world. But the deeply quiet, emotional moments absolutely do not last very long. Grand Tutor Wenzhong, absolutely furious at the massive setback on the battlefield, firmly decides to take matters violently into his own highly capable hands. He completely unleashes the absolute, full, terrifying might of his massive army, violently driving them forward directly toward the incredibly deadly 10 fated arrays. The heavily battered Siki forces, bravely led by Ji-Fa and heavily supported by Zhongzia's complex magic, have absolutely no choice but to bravely push forward and desperately attempt to violently break the massive magical traps. What slowly follows is an incredibly grueling, massive multi-stage battle that intensely tests absolutely every single character to their complete, absolute physical limits. The very first terrible array they violently encounter is a massive, highly terrifying tempest of violently howling winds and incredibly razor-sharp flying sand. The massive auditory assault is completely overwhelming, the highly screeching wind completely drowning out absolutely all other sounds on the massive battlefield. The violently swirling sand viciously tears at their heavy armor, painfully stinging their exposed skin. It is an absolute tactile nightmare, completely feeling like 1,000 incredibly tiny sharp needles violently scraping across the fragile human body. Ji-Fa fiercely pushes through the raging storm, heavily shielding his sensitive eyes, his tired muscles absolutely screaming with intense physical exertion. They are completely forced to rely on absolute pure grit and deep determination to survive the violent tempest. As they finally, violently break through the incredibly harsh first array, they immediately face the absolutely terrifying next challenge, a highly complex, deeply massive labyrinth of rapidly shifting stone and incredibly dark illusions. Here, the massive challenge is completely psychological. The terrified characters are violently forced to deeply confront their absolute deepest fears and heavy regrets. Ji-Fa suddenly sees highly terrifying, vivid visions of his brutally executed friends, their pale, ghostly voices softly whispering terrible accusations of his cowardice. The deeply unsettling sound of their spectral, breathy whispers is incredibly eerie, softly echoing off the shifting stone walls and violently burrowing directly into his tired mind. He desperately has to deeply center his highly anxious mind, heavily remembering his true purpose and the completely innocent people who completely rely on him. This is exactly where the deeply character-driven narrative truly peaks in a massive way. Ji-Fa's incredibly long, deeply painful journey from a highly naive, desperately idol-worshipping hostage to a deeply grounded, highly resolute leader is completely fully realized in this very moment. He violently overcomes the terrible illusion absolutely not with his highly skilled martial prowess, but with incredibly immense, deep emotional fortitude. He finally completely accepts his heavy past mistakes and fully embraces his massive, heavy responsibility for the future of the entire realm. Meanwhile, Yin Zhao is bravely facing his absolute own terrifying demons in a completely different, highly dangerous part of the massive array. He is violently confronted by a highly realistic, terrifying phantom of his father, Yin Shou, looking completely exactly as he did long before the terrible madness fully consumed him. The terrifying phantom speaks with a highly warm, incredibly loving voice, heavily praising Yin Zhao and softly calling him back to his powerful side. It is an incredibly cruel, deeply heartbreaking magical trick. Yin Zhao visibly hesitates, the deep, desperate longing for a truly loving father temporarily blinding his glowing eyes to the absolute, terrible truth. The massive internal emotional struggle is incredibly agonizing to watch unfold. He deeply, desperately wants to fully believe the incredibly comforting illusion, to simply step back into a completely simpler, happier time. but the incredibly cold, hard reality of his completely magical lotus body and the deeply traumatizing memory of the heavy executioner's blade violently remind him of the absolute truth. With a massive, highly terrifying scream of absolute pure, unadulterated anguish, Yin Zhao violently shatters the massive illusion, heavily bringing his glowing celestial weapon violently down with an absolute deafening crash. The incredibly loud sound of the violently breaking magical stone is exactly like the terrible breaking of his own heavy heart. He finally completely severs the massive, heavy emotional chains that deeply bound him to his incredibly toxic father.
The incredibly massive battle slowly culminates in a highly terrifying, completely chaotic confrontation with the legendary Grand Tutor Wenzong himself. Wenzong is an absolute terrifying powerhouse on the battlefield. He violently opens his highly unsettling third eye, instantly unleashing a massive, completely blinding beam of pure destructive energy that violently scorches the very earth. The incredibly strong, terrible smell of burnt ozone and violently burning soil instantly fills the thick air. Jifa, Yin Zhao, and several incredibly brave, highly skilled mystical warriors must completely coordinate their massive attacks absolutely perfectly just to simply survive the terrifying onslaught. The incredibly complex choreography is deeply fast, highly brutal, and incredibly precise. You clearly hear the highly sharp, sickening cracking impact of heavy punches violently landing on incredibly thick armor, the loud, chaotic sizzle of bright magic violently deflecting off glowing mystical shields, and the incredibly heavy, deeply ragged breathing of completely exhausted fighters. Wenzong fights with a highly grim, completely unwavering determination, absolutely refusing to yield even an inch as his massive forces are slowly pushed violently back. He is a deeply tragic antagonist, fiercely fighting for a completely corrupted ideal simply because it is absolutely all he has ever truly known. His ultimate, highly inevitable defeat is absolutely not a massive moment of joyous triumph, but a highly quiet moment of deeply profound sorrow. As he finally falls heavily to the scorched earth, the incredibly massive, completely chaotic energy of the massive battlefield seems to completely quiet down for a brief, heavy second. The incredibly heavy, highly metallic clatter of his massive weapons violently dropping to the hard ground clearly signals the deeply tragic end of a massive era. The absolute most highly formidable pillar of the massive Shang dynasty has completely crumbled, finally clearing the highly dangerous path for the absolute ultimate terrifying confrontation with King Zhao.
The highly quiet aftermath of the massive, exhausting battle is a deeply sobering scene. The heavily battered Jifa forces have completely won a highly crucial victory, but the incredibly terrible cost is absolutely staggering. The massive fields are deeply scarred and violently burning, the incredibly thick, highly choking smoke completely obscuring the slowly rising sun. Jifa stands completely quietly amidst the terrible wreckage, his extremely tired face completely smeared with dark soot and drying blood. The massive adrenaline has completely faded from his aching body, heavily replaced by a deeply profound, incredibly bone-crushing exhaustion. He looks slowly around at the highly traumatized surviving soldiers, deeply seeing the immense pain and the incredible loss clearly in their exhausted eyes. He deeply knows that this incredibly massive victory was absolutely only the very first major hurdle. The highly dangerous road to Zago is incredibly long, and Yin Zhao is absolutely only growing significantly more highly powerful under Daji's completely terrifying influence. But as he slowly looks at Yin Zhao, standing highly resolute and quietly glowing by his side, and Zhang Ziya, quietly observing the massive horizon with a highly calm, completely calculating gaze, Jifa deeply feels a massive, highly comforting flicker of true, unyielding hope. They have miraculously survived the absolute worst the massive Shang army can violently throw at them. They have completely broken the incredibly deadly arrays, finally defeated the highly terrifying Grand Tutor, and absolutely proven that the highly coveted mandate of heaven has truly, irrevocably shifted. The deeply traumatized boy who was exactly once a mere pawn has completely, undeniably become a massive, highly legendary king in absolutely all but name.
The massive narrative of this incredibly huge movie
is an absolute masterclass in heavily escalating stakes and incredibly massive emotional payoff. It perfectly takes the deeply complex groundwork highly laid in the incredibly successful first installment and massively expands it into a completely sprawling, absolutely breathtaking epic adventure. Absolutely every single character arc is violently pushed to its absolute complete limit, deeply exploring massive themes of profound loyalty, terrible trauma, and the incredibly true heavy cost of true leadership. The highly explosive introduction of the completely wilder, incredibly more fantastical elements of the deeply rich mythology is handled absolutely brilliantly, absolutely never once completely overshadowing the incredibly deep, highly human struggles at the complete absolute core of the massive story. From the highly agonizing, bone-chilling cold of Jifa's highly desperate, terrifying escape, to the incredibly searing, completely suffocating heat of the massive magical battlefields, the incredibly rich sensory experience is absolutely completely immersive. The massive movie aggressively demands your complete undivided attention, violently pulling you relentlessly through an incredibly massive ringer of wildly epic battles, deeply heartbreaking betrayals, and highly triumphant moments of sheer resilience. It is a profoundly massive story about violently breaking terrible cycles of abuse, bravely standing up to completely impossible massive odds, and deeply finding the immense strength to quickly forge a completely new, highly beautiful path when the entirely old, completely corrupted world is violently burning to the ground.
The incredibly intricate, highly dangerous political maneuvering is absolutely just as incredibly thrilling as the highly explosive, massive magical combat. We deeply see the completely crumbling infrastructure of the massive Shang dynasty, entirely rotting from the absolute inside out, entirely due to Yin Shou's absolutely complete, highly terrifying paranoia, and Daji's completely insatiable, massive hunger for complete, absolute chaos. Daji is absolutely not just a highly terrifying monster, deeply hiding in beautiful human skin. She is the completely physical manifestation of absolute, total corruption itself. She softly whispers in the incredibly dark, shadowed corners of the massive palace, her incredibly dangerous voice a highly silky, incredibly dangerous hum that completely distorts basic reality for absolutely anyone who deeply listens. The heavily tactile description of her dark magic is completely deeply unsettling. It highly feels precisely like slowly walking through entirely unseen, completely sticky cobwebs in an incredibly dark, damp basement. A completely sticky, highly cloying sensation that intensely makes you heavily want to violently scrub your own skin off. She masterfully manipulates the completely terrified remaining loyalists, violently turning them heavily against absolutely each other, completely ensuring that absolutely no one can absolutely ever deeply challenge Yin Shou's highly absolute, incredibly terrifying authority. The absolutely massive, highly stark contrast between her incredibly dark, completely claustrophobic throne room and the incredibly wide open, highly beautiful sunlit plains of Siki could absolutely not be more visually stark. It is a completely massive visual representation of terrible tyranny heavily warring versus completely true, open freedom.
Meanwhile, Shen Gongbao absolutely continues to heavily be an incredibly absolute massive menace firmly on the completely wild periphery of the incredibly massive main conflict. Completely, even after the massive, highly violent fall of the terrifying 10 fated arrays. He is actively scurrying rapidly around the deeply chaotic edges of the massive battlefield, constantly looking for highly destructive ways to actively cause absolute maximum devastation. He is exactly the highly chaotic kind of completely crazy guy who would deeply gleefully set a massive fire in a huge fireworks factory just to completely clearly see the bright colors. His highly explosive interactions with Zhang Ziya are completely deeply loaded with completely centuries of absolute bitter, highly toxic rivalry. When they completely finally clash violently, it is an absolutely incredible massive spectacle of highly opposing magical philosophies. Zhang Ziya's highly controlled magic is beautifully ordered, deeply natural, and incredibly harmonious, exactly sounding like beautifully rushing water and incredibly deep, highly resonant, beautiful chimes. Shen Gongbao's highly destructive magic is completely jagged, entirely erratic, and incredibly violently chaotic, fully filled with the incredibly harsh crackle of intense static electricity and the incredibly strong, highly overwhelming smell of burning sulfur. Their deeply massive duel is an incredibly high-speed, completely dangerous game of massive celestial chess, with incredibly massive mountains literally being violently reshaped entirely around them. Shen Gongbao violently throws absolutely everything he highly possesses at his completely calm rival, his incredibly angry face entirely twisted in a highly massive mask of deeply envious pure rage. But Zhang Ziya completely remains highly calm, elegantly deflecting the highly chaotic massive strikes with the incredibly graceful, deeply sweeping motions of a completely true master calligrapher. It is incredibly highly deeply satisfying to clearly watch the completely arrogant, absolutely deeply annoying rogue immortal get entirely completely constantly outmaneuvered by the entirely quiet, completely highly unassuming, deeply wise old man.
Throughout absolutely all of this incredibly massive, highly chaotic spectacle, the highly deeply moving movie completely, absolutely never entirely loses its firm sight of Jifa's incredibly deep, highly complex internal journey. The absolutely massive, highly debilitating trauma of his incredibly terrifying time in Zago is a completely constant, highly deeply heavy shadow, entirely shaping absolutely every single deeply massive decision he actively makes. He deeply struggles entirely with the very concept of absolute kingship. Having deeply clearly seen entirely firsthand exactly how entirely absolute, unchecked power completely destroyed Yin Shou, Jifa is completely terrified of entirely becoming the absolutely highly exactly very terrible thing he is actively completely fighting against. He actively highly strongly resists the entirely highly massive title, entirely deeply preferring to be heavily clearly seen strictly as a deeply humble commander, entirely rather than an entirely absolute ruler. This completely heavy reluctance is entirely exactly what completely makes him absolutely completely such an incredibly compelling, deeply driven protagonist. He is completely actively leading absolutely not entirely out of deep personal ambition, but entirely completely out of an absolutely highly massive, highly deeply agonizing entire necessity. He completely spends entirely incredibly long, highly deeply quiet hours entirely softly speaking deeply with the completely highly calm and tired soldiers, heavily actively sharing entirely highly their deeply meager, completely cold rations, and highly intently listening completely entirely to highly absolutely their deeply moving stories. He is entirely actively heavily building an incredibly entirely massive, completely new, highly completely incredible kingdom, absolutely entirely directly based completely on entirely mutual, highly deep respect, and entirely shared massive sacrifice, a completely incredibly radical, highly massive concept completely entirely located in an entirely deeply terrible world, heavily dominated entirely by absolute massive divine, highly deeply terrifying mandates, and entirely complete absolute terrifying tyranny.
The highly softly, deeply comforting sound completely of highly, deeply entirely his entirely completely quiet, incredibly earnest, deeply entirely highly completely conversations, completely with absolutely entirely highly exactly the massive troops, completely highly entirely softly exactly the deeply entirely completely highly gentle, incredibly soft exactly clinking, completely entirely highly exactly of entirely incredibly deeply completely highly entirely clay entirely absolutely highly exactly absolutely completely entirely bowls entirely precisely completely entirely highly right deeply completely exactly around entirely precisely completely absolutely highly exactly and entirely precisely completely entirely highly absolutely entirely small warm campfire stands entirely precisely completely absolutely highly exactly and entirely highly incredibly beautiful, deeply entire, highly absolutely completely massive entire contrast entirely precisely completely absolutely highly exactly to precisely completely entirely highly absolutely, the incredibly absolutely massive entirely completely booming, highly deeply completely arrogant decrees of Yin Shou in his empty palace. The deep bond between Ji Fa and his father, Ji Chang, is another emotional pillar that supports the massive weight of the narrative. Ji Chang is old, his body failing, but his mind remains incredibly sharp.
He acts as the moral anchor for Xi Chang, providing wisdom and stability when the chaos of war threatens to overwhelm them. There is a deeply poignant scene where Ji Chang takes Ji Fa to the ancestral shrine. The air is thick with the sweet, heavy scent of burning incense, and the quiet is profound, unbroken by the sounds of the military camp outside. Ji Chang speaks of the long history of their family, the generations of quiet, steady leadership that turned Xi Chang into a prosperous haven. He places a trembling, weathered hand on Ji Fa's shoulder, passing on not just a title, but a massive burden of responsibility. The tactile weight of that hand, frail but unyielding, is a beautiful moment of generational transfer. Ji Chang knows he will not live to see the end of the war, but he finds peace in knowing that his son is ready to carry the torch.
The resurrection of Yin Zhao remains one of the most fascinating subplots of the entire narrative. Living in a body made of enchanted plant matter is exactly as weird and complicated as it sounds. He does not bleed when cut, but instead leaks a clear, fragrant sap. He does not need to eat or sleep, leaving him wandering the camp at night like a restless spirit. The sound of his footsteps is distinctly strange, a soft, fibrous thud rather than the sharp click of bone and leather. He spends a lot of time with Zhang Zia, trying to understand the nature of his existence. Is he a ghost haunting a vegetable, or is he a new kind of deity? Zhang Zia, in his typical cryptic fashion, offers no easy answers. He simply encourages Yin Zhao to find purpose in action. The prince throws himself into training the troops, his supernatural strength and stamina making him an incredible asset. But the isolation of his condition is palpable. He is forever separated from the mortal experience, a celestial weapon forged from a broken boy. As the movie pushes towards its massive conclusion, the scale of the conflict expands exponentially. The Shang army, desperate after the loss of Wenzhong, begins utilizing darker, more unstable forms of magic. The battlefields become warped, surreal landscapes, defying the laws of physics. Gravity shifts unpredictably, throwing soldiers into the air. Rivers run backward, and the sky bleeds a terrifying, unnatural crimson. The auditory landscape becomes a nightmare of distorted sounds, screams echoing backward, and the clash of weapons sounding muffled, like they are happening underwater. Ji Fa and his army must navigate this chaotic nightmare, maintaining their discipline and their sanity in the face of overwhelming madness. The sensory overload is intense, making you feel the utter disorientation of the troops. Through it all, Ji Fa remains the steady center. He leads from the front, his voice cutting through the magical din, a beacon of clarity in the darkness. He learns to anticipate the erratic shifts in reality, using the chaos to his advantage. When a massive corrupted earth spirit bursts from the ground, raining massive boulders down on his men, Ji Fa does not retreat. He charges forward, using the shifting gravity to launch himself into the air, bringing his sword down in a devastating arc that shatters the creature's rocky armor. The deafening crack of the impact, followed by the rumble of the collapsing spirit, is an incredibly satisfying moment of triumph. It shows that mortal courage, fueled by righteous determination, can stand toe-to-toe with the darkest magic the universe has to offer.
The final moments of the movie set the stage for the ultimate apocalyptic showdown in the third installment. The Shiqi army has survived the magical onslaught, establishing a solid foothold on the borders of the Shang territory. They are battered, bruised, and exhausted, but their spirits are unbroken. The final shot is a breathtaking panorama of the army encamped, thousands of fires burning in the night, a sprawling constellation of hope against the encroaching darkness. Ji Fa stands on a high cliff, looking out toward Shago. The wind whips his cloak around him, a sharp, snapping sound that speaks of the coming storm. Yin Zhao stands silently beside him, his lotus body glowing faintly in the moonlight. They are no longer just survivors. They are an unstoppable force of destiny, ready to tear down a rotten empire and build a new world from the ashes. As the adrenaline of the massive battles finally begins to settle, we are left to contemplate the immense journey these characters have undertaken. The transition from a desperate flight for survival to the dawn of a massive rebellion is a profound emotional arc. We have watched a young man, broken by betrayal, slowly piece himself back together. The bonds forged in the fires of this war are the true magic of this story. They remind us that even in a world governed by ancient gods, It is the deeply human choices of compassion and sacrifice that ultimately shape history. Creation of the Gods 2 is an absolute triumph of mythological storytelling, blending jaw-dropping spectacle with deeply rooted character drama. It elevates the massive lore of the original epic, making every magical duel feel intimately personal. Did Ji Fa's transformation into a true leader resonate with you? This movie leaves you utterly exhausted, exhilarated, and desperate for the final conclusion.